I had always prided myself on my garden. It was the one thing I could control in this neighborhood, a small slice of peace in an otherwise chaotic world. But then Karen from the HOA moved in. At first, it was just a few casual mistakes, her car brushing against the hedge, a tire on the grass. I let it slide. But when she ran over my hedge for the 5th time, something snapped. I had warned her. I had tried to be polite, but Karen didn't care. She thought it was funny, an inconvenience for me to handle. But no more. I wasn't going to let her disrespect my space, my hard work, and my boundaries any longer. This time, I was ready. And this time, I was going to make her regret it. I'd always found peace in my garden. The hedge I'd carefully nurtured for years wasn't just plants, it was a symbol of my hard work and quiet joy. Every leaf, every branch, carefully trimmed to perfection. It was my sanctuary from the world, and I was proud of it. Then came Karen. With her loud, perfectly manicured nails and a scowl that seemed permanently etched on her face, she was the type of person who couldn't respect boundaries. As the president of the HOA, she saw herself as the neighborhood's self-appointed ruler. I'd barely spoken to her before the first incident, her car, tires skimming over my hedge. I gave her a polite warning. But instead of apologizing, she just smiled that smug smile. The next day, she did it again. Only this time, my patience was wearing thin. Something had to change. And I knew exactly what. It started small, just an occasional tire mark on the grass. But Karen wasn't satisfied with just that. Every time I'd fix the damage, she'd casually cruise past, her tires once again skimming the edge of my hedge. At first, I thought it was a mistake, but soon, it became a routine. She didn't even try to hide it anymore. One morning, I found a note on my doorstep. It was from the HOA, stamped with their official seal. Please keep your hedges trimmed and clear of the sidewalk. Your garden is becoming an eyesore. I stood there, fuming, as I reread it. An eyesore? It was her driving over it that was the problem. But the HOA had her back. They backed her up without a second thought. I tried to stay calm. I didn't want to escalate things, but every time I saw her pull into the driveway, I could feel my blood pressure rising. I couldn't keep letting her do this. My garden was more than just plants, it was my pride, my escape from everything else in this crazy neighborhood. I had to act. First, I decided to put up a few signs. Do not drive over the hedge, they said, in bold, glaring letters. I even added a warning about fines, just to make it official. I thought for sure that would work, but no. The next day, Karen sped past the sign and ran straight over the hedge again. The sign was still standing, untouched, but my hedge was once again crushed beneath the weight of her car. I couldn't believe it. The nerve of this woman. Did she really think she could just walk all over me? I'd had enough. Next, I built a small fence, nothing too elaborate, just a low wooden barrier that would be a clear deterrent. It wasn't meant to keep her out completely, but to send a message. But as I was putting the last post in place, I saw Karen rolling up the street. She slowed down, eyed the fence, and then just drove right through it. The wooden posts cracked under the weight of her car, splintering across my driveway. She didn't even slow down, not once. It was like she was daring me. Daring me to do something about it. I felt completely powerless. It was as if she knew she could do whatever she wanted, and the HOA would always take her side. They kept sending me those passive-aggressive letters, telling me my fence was too low, my garden needed to be trimmed just right, that I was disturbing the aesthetic of the neighborhood. Meanwhile, Karen continued her daily destruction, laughing behind my back as she cruised past, wrecking my garden without a care in the world. That night, I sat by the window, staring at the shattered fence. My mind was racing. The frustration, the anger, it all boiled to the surface. My patience had worn thin. I wasn't going to take it anymore. I knew something had to be done. Something big. Something that would finally make Karen realize she couldn't just walk all over me. But I wasn't just going to destroy her car, no. I was going to make sure she understood the cost of her actions. I wasn't going to give her an easy out, not this time. I stood up, went to my workbench in the garage, and started gathering tools. I wasn't sure exactly what I'd do yet, but I knew it was going to be something that would change everything. Something she'd never forget. The plan was coming together in my mind, piece by piece. I smiled to myself. I had been patient. I had tried the polite route. But now? Now, Karen would learn what happens when you push someone too far. And when I was finished, she'd never, ever mess with my Hedge again. The morning I'd been waiting for finally arrived. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting a soft glow over the neighborhood. I stood by my window, watching Karen's car parked in her driveway, gleaming in the early light. Today would be the day. Today, everything would change. I had spent the last few days preparing, every moment of frustration and anger poured into this one perfect plan. I'd carefully set up a series of invisible obstacles along the edge of my hedge, cleverly hidden so that Karen wouldn't see them coming. It wasn't about destroying her car, it was about making her look like a fool in front of everyone. I had already worked out the timing. Karen was predictable, always leaving for her early morning walks, her car engine roaring to life at precisely 8:15 a.m. And sure enough, as the clock struck 8, I saw her coming out of her front door, her usual smug smile plastered on her face. She was about to drive over my hedge once again. I couldn't help but feel a little satisfaction as I grabbed the remote hidden in my pocket. The small, carefully disguised sensors I'd installed under the ground near my hedge had one job today, to trigger the perfect consequence. As Karen's car pulled forward, I pressed the button. The first thing that happened was a loud click, followed by a soft grinding noise. Before Karen could react, the car lurched forward, its front tires suddenly lifted off the ground. The sensors I'd set up underneath had triggered a hidden ramp, causing her car to rise just enough to set off an unexpected chain of events. Her rear tires spun wildly in the air, but she couldn't go forward anymore. Karen panicked, slamming her foot down on the gas, but nothing happened. The car wasn't moving. The look of confusion on her face was priceless. Then, I watched as the second part of my plan went into motion. The ramp I'd installed was part of a clever series of mechanisms linked to an old garden sprinkler system. As the car stalled, water shot up, dousing her entire vehicle with a blinding spray of foam and water. The car's front bumper, now completely submerged in the sprinkler's path, was covered in a thick, sudsy mess. At first, Karen's expression was one of pure disbelief. She stepped out of her car, looking around, trying to figure out what was going on. And then, I heard it, the shrill, familiar voice calling out to me. "You did this!" Karen shrieked, her face flushed with rage. "This is vandalism. You're going to pay for this." But she hadn't realized I had prepared for this. A few of the neighbors, who had been watching from their windows, were now standing outside, shaking their heads and laughing. They knew exactly what had been going on between us for weeks. Some of them even cheered, taking out their phones to record. And then, the final part of my revenge unfolded. As Karen started to argue with the neighbors, demanding that they call the HOA, I made my move. The water from the sprinkler had created a thick, soapy puddle beneath her car, and as she tried to back up, her tires spun helplessly in the wet mess. The car wasn't going anywhere. I casually strolled out of my house, pretending to just notice what was happening. "Looks like your car's stuck," I said with a grin. Her eyes nearly popped out of her head. You did this," she screamed, her voice rising. "I did warn you," I said, keeping my tone cool and calm. "You've driven over my hedge one too many times, Karen. Maybe next time, you'll think twice before ignoring boundaries." By now, most of the neighbors had gathered, some chuckling quietly. One neighbor even asked her, "You didn't see the signs," referring to the ones I'd put up weeks ago. The HOA was already getting phone calls, too, as several people began to film the scene. It was clear the karma was already working its magic. And when the tow truck finally arrived, Karen looked even more embarrassed than angry. Her precious car was now the subject of every neighbor's conversation, the video being shared all over the neighborhood. And as the tow truck drove away with her soaked, foamy vehicle, I could only smile. Karen may have thought my hedge was a joke, but now, everyone would know who the real joke was. Karen stood there, her face a mixture of shock and fury, as the tow truck slowly pulled away with her car. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides, and her mouth was working, but no words seemed to come out. It was as if the reality of being outsmarted, caught in the middle of a neighborhood spectacle, hadn't fully hit her yet. "You're dead," she finally screamed, her voice cracking. But the more she yelled, the more ridiculous she looked, standing there in her soaked clothes with nothing to do but stare at her now missing car. I felt a tiny pang of guilt, but it was quickly washed away by the satisfaction that surged through me. She deserved this. After everything she'd put me through, after all the disrespect, it felt good to see her get a taste of her own medicine. I wasn't a cruel person, but this felt justified. As the neighbors began to disperse, the reactions were mixed. Some clapped, others exchanged amused glances. "You really got her good," one of them called out, giving me a thumbs up. But there were a few who looked uncomfortable, whispering to each other. A couple of them, especially the ones who were more sympathetic toward Karen, seemed unsure of how to feel. But I didn't care anymore. The HOA was already getting calls, but by the time they decided to do anything, it was too late. Karen's humiliation was already complete. The balance had shifted, and for once, she was the one being watched, not me. As I sat in my garden, the sun shining down on my now undisturbed hedge, I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. The tension, the frustration, gone. It had been a long time coming, but I finally stood my ground. Karen may have thought she could walk all over me, but in the end, she learned that disrespecting someone's boundaries has consequences. Looking back, I'm not sure I'd do it all over again, but it felt good to take control of the situation. The balance in the neighborhood has shifted, and now, my hedge is safe, along with my pride. I learned that standing up for yourself isn't always about being the bigger person. Sometimes, it's about sending a message that's heard loud and clear. Guess Karen will think twice before messing with my hedge again, and I'm really not sorry about it.